Hi, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of Office Hours. I just wanted to take a few minutes to answer some of the questions that came up during the I Was Wondering discussion board topic. And I just wanted to thank everybody for participating in that. And I read through all of the questions. There were some great responses in there. And we had a really good dialogue, I think. But I just wanted to add my opinion on some of these, or just make sure some of these questions got answered. And we wouldn't really have time to do that in class. But this was a great way for me to see what you were thinking about or curious about. I'm going to start with, and just to apologize, sometimes I'm going to name some students just if they had a question on there. And so if I mispronounce any names, sorry about that. I'm going to try my hardest. Also, there sometimes were questions that had, there were very many examples with similar questions. So I probably just picked one of them that would represent the other questions. So I'm going to start actually by talking about the two responses that had two posts that had the most responses. One was by Irene Moreno Gutierrez and then Anna Mucher. And these questions were similar, and they both had 8 total posts or responses, so that was very good. So Irene started by saying, I don't really have any questions, but something I found myself doing is really tripping over myself when I speak. And I don't know if it's because of this class, but I'm constantly analyzing how I say things and wondering if I'm saying them right or wrong. Has anyone else had this problem lately? And Anna added too that I don't have anything at the moment I'm wondering about, but I've definitely learned a ton of new things. It's been really cool to hear language differently now that I'm taking phonetics. I feel like I pay way more attention to sounds from my words when I'm talking. I'm starting to be able to tell where words are coming from when I speak, which is a pretty cool thing. So I just want, they're very similar ideas, and this generated a lot of response. And so I think all of you probably have similar feelings that because of this course, you're starting to analyze more what you're doing, what other people around you are doing, and so you're developing that awareness. And I mentioned that when we started talking about reduced speech, people sometimes are in a little bit of denial, and they really can't imagine that they're doing some of these things. But with time, you'll start to hear them. Now, the other thing that I noticed from some posts was that people sort of have this idea that maybe they're producing things the wrong way. And so, maybe I'm not moving my tongue the way it's supposed to be. Well, I think from the perspective of most SLPs and linguists, certainly coming from that descriptivist perspective, there's really, if you're a native speaker, you're not doing anything wrong. If you're doing something wrong, then you probably had speech therapy, or at some point it was corrected when you were younger. But it's at this age as adults rare for speakers to do things the wrong way. So whatever you're doing is the right way. And I think you're going to start developing an awareness of what's actually going on. So students come to me with questions sometimes, and they'll say, well, I noticed, for example, the L, that we call that alveolar, like la, 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 la. You could even see, probably I could see that my tongue came out sometimes. And you'll watch speakers that sometimes like, love it, I love it. And their tongue is fully outside of their, between their teeth, just like the interdentals. So there's quite a bit of range, and we're going to study a little bit more of that in the unit that's coming next. So people should develop that awareness, but you should feel confident that if you're a native speaker, that you are producing these things the right way, and that you're just going to learn more about what's actually going on. So there were also quite a few questions about the use of the IPA and transcription by SLPs, audiologists, and other professionals. So Liana Sanchez wrote, what would a career in phonetics look like? In what situations would you use IPA? And so I'll start with that one, because your career in phonetics, probably most of you are not going to go into that, and there really aren't very many jobs. So a career in phonetics, you're going to have a hard time, I think, finding an opening. But I guess in phonetics, you can go into research, you can go into teaching, you can be a field phonetician where you're out there trying to transcribe languages, but that's not what most people are really interested in this class. So there certainly are careers in that, but I think I'll spend some more time talking about what SLPs do and audiologists. Well, starting with the audiologist, because Ashlyn Richards added, I honestly have been wondering about how this class will fit into becoming an SLP. I also was wondering if this class is going to be beneficial to either becoming an SLP or an audiologist. So to start with audiology, obviously there's going to be less use of the IPA, and audiologists do work with words, and they'll do some words in sound kind of tests to make sure that that their clients can actually hear and identify the words. So that's one thing that they're trying to listen for, not just the pure tone, not to just hear if somebody can hear a specific frequency, but they also need to know if someone can actually hear the words around them. That's much more practical. But the actual application of transcription, for example, to a career in audiology is probably very minimal. And I think most audiologists just use their understanding of phonetics to inform their work, when they're working with SLPs, but it's not a big part of their job. But for SLPs, it just depends. So I think I try to be as honest about that as possible, because I don't want to really give the impression that every SLP out in the world is using IPA all day long. That's certainly not the case. So what I try to start with is to say grad school, to start with grad school, because to be an SLP, you've got to go to grad school. And in grad school, you will be doing transcription. You will have to show an understanding of IPA. You're going to be studying in much more detail some of the same topics that we'll cover in this class. So you do need IPA for sure to get through grad school. Now, after you graduate from grad school and you go on to get your license, then it just completely depends on which area of our field that you end up working in. So for example, if you work with young kids, you're probably going to maintain your transcription skills and have a good understanding of phonology. That's going to be a part of your life. And when Jennifer Taps-Richard comes out to talk to our class in November, she's going to show you exactly what you might do and how you might transcribe, and even use your understanding of phonetics to figure out children's their sound systems and what they need to work on in order to improve their speech. So that's going to be very important for those of you working with young kids. If you're working in a high school with older kids, probably less likely, although you still are going to need some basic knowledge of the IPA, I think. If you work in the hospitals, then it's very unlikely. So I think most of my hospital-based SLP friends probably have forgotten a lot of their transcription skills. So it would be, it just wouldn't be right if I tried to tell you that every SLP uses transcription all the time. But I think it's such an important part of our field, since it really goes to the very heart of what we do, which is working with speech and language. But the speech part there, to really understand how it works, how the speech sounds are made, and that phonemic awareness I told you about, the ability to break up any word into the sounds, is just crucial for most people working with any element of actual oral language. Now, there are some questions about IPA. There were many questions relating to the origin of the IPA, and even quite a few that talked about why we don't study it earlier. So a lot of people had the opinion that maybe we should have this in school instead of working so much on spelling. And that's a good point. And it kind of and a couple of the questions, for example, well, I'll go to some other questions, but about the origin of the IPA, it actually did start that way with language teaching. So it was some really English teachers and French teachers in Europe who were trying to figure out a systematic way to teach English, especially. So they were really ESL teachers, and they most of the early work took place in France, and I think there were members. The original members were mostly from France, from England, Germany, and then it started to spread out to the rest of Europe. But then it became international. So it started with that idea of teaching, helping people learn foreign language. And then it went into that idea of transcription and phonetics, and then that kind of bigger global picture of now let's try to figure out every language in the world. So it's a little Eurocentric the way it started and with some of the original characters, but it has expanded to the point where it covers all of the world's languages. So people did have questions about that, and I'll try to answer that. But the IPA chart, there's not a specific IPA chart that for each country or language. I mean, that yes and no to that. There's still the one chart that covers everything. And then each language just takes those symbols from that chart to sort of show how it works in their own language. But everything that you need is on that chart. Someone asked, and this was Aaron Trombador, said, I was wondering about how new sounds are added to the IPA. So you can join the IPA. It costs about, I think it's like $38 a year to join. So anyone can join, and you could join as a student. It's probably half price. And the IPA, they have regular meetings, they have a journal, and basically people will propose. They'll say, I was out in Indonesia or somewhere in some small village, and I heard this sound, and it's nowhere on the IPA chart, and they tape record it or whatever they do to try to show that this is something that someone's using. But again, it's been a while. I think the last sound was added in 2005, I believe. I think that was the last one. So there really hasn't been one. And we're probably getting to the point where we're not really going to find any. But so yeah, that's how they're added. And Iris Marie Martinez said, I've been wondering if we are going to learn the whole chart and utilize every symbol sound. I'm very curious to learn the Greek symbols and what sounds they make. I'm wondering how the IPA and phonetics in general will help me when I'm learning a new language such as Spanish. So a couple of things here, but are you going to have to learn the whole chart? No. So you really just need the parts that apply to English. And then we're going to learn the diacritics in this next unit. So you'll learn a little bit more detail about how English works, but that's still pretty much all on the chart. And then in that third unit that we have in late October, starting in late October and November, we will learn a couple symbols from other languages, but you don't have to learn a lot. It's probably about 8 additional symbols. Some of them are used in English, but most of them are ones that we're just trying to show you. Some of them are from Spanish because we have so many Spanish speakers here. And how will the IPA help you with another language? It should help quite a bit. So a lot of times people will report back and they'll say that now that I know IPA and I started studying this other language, it made it so much easier to understand the sound system. I know for me too. So I haven't studied a language for quite a while. The last one I learned was Portuguese. It was a while back. But if I started to study a new language now, or when I hear, my son was studying a little bit of Chinese, it made much more sense to me because I could see that, okay, this is that sound. All right, that's what that is. If it's something that's different that I didn't recognize, but it's all on the IPA, it should make much more sense to you. There were some questions about transcription. Kira Turner asked, how do we transcribe 2-worded objects? Would they each have their own slashes or would they be just placed together? So it really doesn't matter. You can just put them, if it's like a compound noun or even an entire phrase, you can put it together without any breaks if the person said it with no breaks. You can indicate word boundaries too. The IPA allows you to do that. Or you could transcribe each word separately. So there's really no rule on that. Certainly if it's just a short phrase, like if somebody says something like, I'm trying to think of a good example, apartment complex or something, right? And you just want to transcribe that, just put it all together in one thing. It's really not a problem. Jasmine Cruz wrote, I was wondering if 2 people transcribed a word and they transcribed it differently, who would technically be more accurate and if one would be considered a better SLP than the other? Well, this type of thing is fairly rare, but it'll happen when someone's doing like research and they're doing a study and they might have multiple transcribers to make sure that everybody's doing this accurately. And they will compare and they'll try to figure out if there's a discrepancy. Certain things don't count as differences, so it's very important to remember those ones, like the schwa and the little capital I. Those generally, if it's an unstressed situation, are not going to matter if somebody picked one or the other. It shouldn't matter. But if there's a major difference between the sounds, then I think the transcribers would probably try to figure out, exactly where the breakdown occurred. But again, there's not going to be any way to officially decide that because it is subject to interpretation. And I don't think people get in many contests about that, about who's a better SLP or not, or better transcriber. Certainly some are better than others, but nobody, I think, feels 100% confident all the time with transcription. It's something we all think about. When I hear a word and I have to transcribe it in narrow transcription, I have to think about it very carefully too, just like all of you. I just have much more experience. But for everybody, it's going to be something that you're not just going to automatically start writing in narrow transcription. The broad transcription gets much easier, and that's the one that people get pretty confident in. There were a lot of questions about other languages. So Atziri Baraja asked, by the end of the course, will I be able to transcribe other languages besides English, or are there separate phonetics courses for other languages? Yeah, I mean, there would be, of course, separate courses to study in detail languages, but we are going to get a little bit of practice with that. So we probably won't really transcribe much in here from other languages, but I will show you transcriptions from other languages. And now you'll be able to understand how they sound. And we'll be doing some Spanish, a little bit of Spanish. And then also Marissa Rehana said, I was wondering if other variations of the IPA according to a country is more complex than our own variation. Are there sounds we don't use in English, or are sounds that are specific to English more difficult to learn? So yes, there are certainly sounds that we don't use in English. So if you look at the IPA chart, there are plenty that we don't use at all. And some of them we will talk about that are used in English, even though they're not phonemes. So they might just come up every once in a while. So a good example of that would be the sound, which is the palatal fricative. It might sound weird to you if you think of, I don't really say that in English. But then if you think maybe somebody's going to say, oh, look at that cute baby, and they say cute, and you've got it right there. So those are the kinds of things that we are going to have a look at. Maria Granado said, I understand growing up with the language makes it seem easy since it's what you're surrounded by. Also, knowing certain languages makes others easier to learn. For example, if you speak Spanish, learning Italian is typically less difficult than it would be if you're a monolingual English speaker. If you were to disregard the previously listed factors, is there a language that is more phonetically challenging than the rest? So this is a great question. Mariah, brings up some very good points about this that, and not everyone agrees on this 100%, but many people believe, and this is my belief, that all languages are essentially equally complex, more or less. Now we're taking the writing system off the table because that's obvious. If you want to learn, for example, like my wife's language or Korean, my wife speaks Hungarian or Korean or something like that, or even Spanish, because Spanish is a lot closer than English. The writing system is much closer to the way people speak. So to learn the writing of my wife's language or Korean, just for some examples of very phonetic alphabets, you could learn how to write that in a weekend, really. So you could actually learn so that I could read out loud a Korean book and I could kind of read through it. Of course, it would sound really funny, but individual words I could probably say with just a weekend's worth of training, and yet I wouldn't know what I'm saying. I wouldn't understand it at all. Versus languages like English, that's right. It's going to take you some time to learn the writing system. We already talked about all the spelling problems. And then think of a language like Japanese with their kanji or the different alphabets that they have, or Chinese, where it's going to take you your life, really. So you have high school students in those countries that are still, when they read a newspaper, some of the characters are unfamiliar to them. So if you take all that off the table, the writing system, then of course some languages have more words to them. Some languages have a lot of other different things that go on that seem complicated, but they're all basically equally complex. You can always find so many crazy exceptions in all the languages to the way that they work. And we don't have any languages, for example, that are so complex that children just don't learn them until much later than children who speak other languages. No, all the kids learn all the languages all around the same time. So we know they're all kind of in the same ballpark. So what makes a language really harder to learn or easier to learn? Just like Mariah said, it's related to what you actually speak. So if you speak Spanish and you want to learn Italian, they share many similar features of grammar and vocabulary. So it's not going to take you as long as if you're a Spanish speaker and you now want to learn something like Cambodian or something, right? That's going to take you a long time. You have to learn all the new words. They're totally different. The grammar is very different, right? If you speak Polish, and I tell you you're going to learn Ukrainian or Russian, it's going to be much easier than if I tell you now you have to learn Finnish, which is an unrelated language, right? So it just depends on what the languages, how they're related to each other. Gabriela Ruiz said, I was wondering if it's true that infants, toddlers who are exposed to 2 or more languages lack language development milestones. For example, if a child since birth is exposed and spoken to in English and Spanish, will they speak later rather than sooner because of confusion? And so the answer is no. So the research at the moment, basically everything, all the research that we have now kind of points to this conclusion that bilingual kids basically meet their developmental milestones at about the same time as monolingual kids, kids who just speak one language. So in other words, they're all right around hitting the targets right around the same time. We're not expecting delays. I do hear sometimes, I was talking recently to a parent, she was concerned about her child who was bilingual. And she said, well, I know that, everybody's telling me that it's normal to have some delays because of the 2 languages. And I thought, well, no, it's actually not normal. So we don't really expect delays. Now, you can sometimes have some differences in vocabulary and the way with younger, especially the younger kids. So there's some research on this that, for example, what will happen is you might have, let's say that we've got, this is the monolingual, like a 5-year-old. Let's say take a 5-year-old. Monolingual has this many words that they know in their one language. And the bilingual child age 5 knows this many in one language and this many in the other, right? It's not as many as up here, but look at these together. It's up here now, right? So actually, that can cause a little bit of a difference sometimes with some of these issues. Like they might not, if you're comparing monolinguals to bilinguals, especially at a younger age, you might notice some differences, but it doesn't mean that there's any kind of delay. So, and remember, this applies no matter what the cognitive ability of the, or levels of the individual. So children with profound cognitive delays, so, children with intellectual disability are able to learn their two languages just the same way as they would learn one language. So there's really, it's never really, there's no good reason. If you have a bilingual situation, for example, dad speaks English, mom speaks Spanish in the household, then there's no good reason not to introduce those two languages to a child at any level. So anyway, that's a little off topic for this class, but it's an interesting subject. Accents and dialects, that ties in too. So Maya Ruan said, my question is how accents and dialects come into play with phonetics. Do we transcribe it how it's said with an accent? Yes, that's one of the beauties of this. So we are going to, right before the final, we're going to have a class talking about accents and dialects. And that's, I'm sure you've heard, that's kind of my area, my specialty. So I just wrote a book on accents that came out in March. And I love dialects and accents too. So we are going to learn how to transcribe, and that's part of the beauty of it. We've already talked about a little bit of that with the different vowels. And then Janelle, actually, not sure I'm going to read this whole thing, but well, I'll go ahead and start. Janelle Stratford said, is there always a correct and incorrect way to say a word? And can it vary with dialect and accents? So to answer that, I would say, no, it varies, right? So we have lots of differences. Some of them are regional, and some of them are just what we call idiolectic, like everybody's different. So sometimes people say often, other people say often. It doesn't really matter where you're from. There might be trends in different parts of the country, but otherwise you could live in the same neighborhood. And then she said, I know there are a few words that my parents from the Midwest and South pronounce differently than I do, and I was born and raised here, such as the word permit. Now, permit has two pronunciations for most of us, right? Because we have permit and permit. So I'm not sure if that was the issue there. Also, I can't get the word caramel or caramel out of my head. I know people from the same city pronounce it differently. And so if you go, I sent a little graphic and I answered Janelle online. There's something I found out of the Southwest Airlines magazine that was talking about that word caramel or caramel. People would pronounce a different way. She also listed pecan because it's pecan, right? There are different variations. So this is a fascinating subject. There's quite a bit of variation in English. And Raksha Mishra asked too, my question that I have is how are accents formed? What are the main factors that produce an accent in speech? Does the stress part matter more, or is it the phonation? I understand the fact that people who speak different languages have accents, but people who speak the same language also have accents according to differences in geography, etc. Right? Also, can one get rid of an accent, or do we just adapt to them? Yeah, so accents are formed, the different variations, there are a couple of reasons. A lot of times it's geography, because basically people lived on this side of the mountain or that side of the river, and they didn't communicate in the older days, right? And then over time, you could almost think of almost like evolution. If you go to the Galapagos Islands, right, you've got some birds that are going to that fly to that island. They're going to develop over there differently than the ones who are on the mainland. The same thing with people moving around with their accents. So people got on their boats, went over from England over to America. And then there was that separation. So they weren't in contact. And then local things, languages change. And so these accents start to develop. What I think people forget is that they imagine that British English somehow stayed the same for the last however many thousand years or so, right? And then American English just changed into this weird thing that's not quite as good. That's what people think. But that's not the way it works, right? What happens is they're separated, they're both changing, and then they sound different after time. And so there are some things we have in American English that are actually older forms that stayed with us that they got rid of over in England. So a lot of times it's the geography plus time, right? And that separates things out. We also have social dialects, right? So where somebody in a particular group is going to sound different. So for example, African-American English is a classic example of that. So you may have people who live in the same neighborhood but have different dialects based on this, basically for social reasons. So that's how accents develop. And then what happens? And then why do individuals have accents? And we'll talk about that later in the class, but that's because basically at a certain point, it really becomes fixed in your mind. So really it's around the time of puberty, people who are able to move around. So if you take, for example, a 5-year-old child, and I could take somebody from right now from my neighborhood, 5-year-old, and if we move to China, then that 5-year-old is going to grow up and speak Chinese without an accent. I'm going to have an accent because I'm older. So that's what happens. There's like a critical period, it's called, and it's around puberty. And after that, adults have accents. So it's very normal. It's natural for adults to have accents. They don't really go away or disappear. And there's no reason that they should, because people can function effectively with an accent. It doesn't matter. It's really just about being effective, an effective communicator. Here's a couple questions about English and the history of English. So Angelina Lopez said, the more exposure we have to phonetics, the more I can't help but question, why is the English language so hard? And then I never questioned before, but now I wish I'd learned more languages, or at least took learning them more seriously at a younger age. So, right, why is English language so hard? So again, we said all the languages are really probably equal, but what we're talking about here is the connection between the spelling system and the sounds. And English just, unfortunately, when our spelling system was coming into being, it was right around the time we had a lot of changes in the way we pronounce words, and languages change all the time. And so we weren't able to reflect. Sometimes our spelling reflects the older pronunciation of the word. Also, English is a huge language spoken all around the world in many different places. And so it's very hard to create one standard form that would reflect the way people actually say words, because which standard are you going to go by? New Zealand, United States, South Africa, England, Ireland, where are you going to pick? So we're really kind of stuck. Some languages are smaller and they're able to keep that and represent the way the sounds are created a little bit better. But that's probably why English is complicated in terms of the phonetics. Peter Mitri said, I guess something I've always thought about is how English can disregard certain rules that certain letters typically abide by. For example, how is the word colonel, and remember everybody how that's spelled, that's Colonel, like a colonel in the army. How is the word kernel transcribed the same way as kernel, Kernel, like a popcorn kernel, when the former doesn't even have an R in it? I would love to learn more about this kind of topic. Yes, and so I did look into that one. That's a good one, a good point, because kernel is spelled without any kind of R in it, but it's pronounced with the R. So I looked into that a little bit, and these things get very complicated, but basically we were borrowing some terms, 600-700 years ago, many military terms from Italian, from French. The original word for colonel had to relate to, it had the L because it related to a column. It was someone who could lead a column of soldiers. And then, but apparently when it entered into French, they disassociated and started that R. I guess sometimes words will change over time, and maybe it sounds better, or they slip in a sound. But that sound kind of transferred over into English too, but the spelling stayed the same. So that's basically the story there. But yeah, these words have interesting histories, and you just have to, from a phonetics point of view, you just think IPA, right? I just know kernel, this is how I'm going to transcribe it. It doesn't really matter how it's spelled. It's an interesting story. Isabella Sasueta said, I was wondering if there have been any sounds in the past that have ever faded out of the system because they've stopped being used, just like how hua, the voiceless bilabial fricative, is not used as much, right? And so that one is the one we talked about. Remember we said that it's going, the labiovelar fricative. It's also interesting because I looked into this sound quite a bit, and this is like, remember, some people say white instead of white, or where are you, and that kind of thing, right? And that's faded out quite a bit. So I did look into this. I was very curious about this too. And it was just fascinating to learn what's going on here. But basically, sounds do change over time. We added a couple sounds into English. We added the je. That came, I don't know how long, probably when the French speakers came, which was the Norman conquest in about 1,000 years ago. we lost some sounds. We lost other ones that was kind of, I think, the point of the question. We lost the h sound that we had, and we had the h sound too. So we lost those ones. And how did we lose this one? Well, I mean, the way that it even was formed, it's probably going to be kind of lengthy. I'll try to keep it pretty simple here. But basically, the idea is that all of these question words, and think about it, we often talk about WH questions, which is right, because that explains the typical questions that we have that are not yes, no questions, but they're like where, when, why. But we've also got how, right? And who, and how has the H sound, and who, right, has the H sound, even though that one is also spelled with WH. So basically what happened, it was a very complicated story, but originally these were spelled up until I think the 13th century as HW, because that makes more sense, right? Where, it's kind of devoicing that W. And then at some point we switched the spelling. Not sure why that happened. Maybe because we have other digraphs like CH, TH, SH. Maybe that's why that happened. But the sound itself was also changing. So the qua was originally, it started originally as more like a qua. And if you think about Spanish, because these are related to Latin too, you've got a lot of your question words like cuando, right? You've got that what sound. And so that was, these are related languages. English and Spanish are related, and German. We're all part of a big language group called Indo-European languages. So they originally, going 5,000 years ago, were more like a qua, and then became hua in English. And then basically the h part started to drop off, and it just became the wa with the voicing. So the sound changed. Now, what's interesting is that it's still around in the US. I think it's like 15%. I found a map that showed where they do a lot of this. It's in the South. But I didn't know this. I didn't really realize that it actually died out in England almost completely, in the south of England, where the prestige dialects are spoken, like London. And it died out there. It's done. So that happened before the US, because we often think of these things, you would imagine that, like I said, that the British English might preserve some of these, but no, not in this case, right? We're the ones preserving this in that case. Now, Nicole Corman asked, I don't necessarily have a question, but I'm curious about how words become words. In class, we talked about open class words like Google, Uber, and yes, right. So, and then I was just curious if anyone knows any boundaries for English words. Well, right, that's what's interesting, I think, for the purposes of this class, because words are created because just anybody could make up a word. I mean, something comes up, you have a new product or a new thing, or someone just comes up with something. I mean, they just come out of nowhere, but they're gonna observe the basic rules of English. And then sometimes there'll be little exceptions that people throw out there. I mentioned to some of my students that, I hear, they'll tell me that there's a word zhuzh, which is interesting, right? But it starts with a zh, and that's rare. So even though it's permissible in English, it's not really very common. So that's kind of an interesting one. Another one I think is interesting is pho, for the Vietnamese food, because again, we don't have words that end on that mid-central vowel. So that one kind of violates some of our rules, even though we do have the word the. So these rules are going to be followed. So we're not going to have, like, nobody's going to create a word that starts with a T and a K, like takoina or something, right? We just don't have that in English, right? So basically we are going to follow those phonotactics of our language. Okay, consonants and vowels. Isabel Spanbauer said, one thing I was wondering was how to better differentiate post-alveolar and palatal sounds. All the other sounds make sense to me, but I still have trouble with these two because the tongue placement seems very similar to me. Also, another topic I was wondering about was the vowels. I'm having a difficult time between rounded and unrounded. And so, yeah, the basic idea here. So, right, they do seem similar here, but if you get like the alveolar ridge, I think people have an easier time figuring that out. So like la 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 la, right? We've got a lot going on in the alveolar ridge. And then if you take your S and kind of pull it back, and I've also got secondary articulation here, but I can feel my tongue going back just a little bit, not too much. Now the palatal sounds, and that's why it's post-alveolar. The palatal sound in English, we just have the ya. But if you speak Spanish, then you'd be familiar with the ñ, which is the nasal, palatal nasal, right? Now we have it in English too, in a word like onion, but it's not a phoneme in English. So we would just transcribe that as the N plus the ya, which is our one palatal sound. For the vowels, a lot of people were asking about how to learn the vowels, but I think that idea of just memorize it until you feel it. So that's probably the way to go, is just study that quadrilateral. Molly Brown asked, I was wondering about the best way to differentiate, and she put "g," but I think she meant "ja," probably, differentiate between the "j" sound and the "zh" sound, right? Well, that's the same exact difference between "ch" and "sh." It's just with the voicing. But we don't have a lot of "zhs," and that's why people get confused. But think about a word like measure with a "zh" in it. That's a fricative, right? Measure versus major, j. That is an affricate, major. It's not measure. He's a major in the army. Major, j. It just comes out that one time. So it's the same thing as wash, watch, right? Sh, ch. It's just that we've got j, much less common, and j with the voicing. Here are a couple of miscellaneous questions I could wrap things up with here. Nadia Pisano said, what is the purpose of having the word rhyme in the tree? Why doesn't the tree just say onset, nucleus, and coda? Well, I've mentioned, I think, this is such a great question. It really made me think about this quite a bit. We don't have to worry too much more about the syllable structure. I think we have the basic idea now. As long as you're comfortable with the principles of it. You've got your onset, you've got your rhyme, which has the nucleus and the coda in it. Well, I guess when I thought about it, I thought, well, it probably has to do, even think about the word rhyme, which is sometimes spelled R-I-M-E, not the same way as the rhyme, maybe just to distinguish it, but it's related to that idea of rhyming. And when we rhyme words, what really counts? The ending part counts. So I think that's where it really, how this developed, because you could rhyme words that are open syllables, like go and doe, throw, but you could also rhyme words that are enclosed syllables, like cat, hat, mat. But with the rhyme, we don't care if you have like cat and if we're changing, if we're trying to keep the front part similar, like cat, cab, can, we don't think of those as rhymes. So the idea of the rhyme is the ending of the word, and that's why the fact that it could be open or closed, I think, is what created that separate level. I did look into it, got extremely complex, and I started to, my eyes glazed over too, because when you get into the syllable structure stuff, it gets very theoretical. But that's my best answer I think I could give you. Brianna Williams says, will we be learning in this class how to correct mistakes when people are using the wrong part of their mouth to pronounce a word? Is that a common thing in speech disorders? Yes, it is a common thing. We're not going to really do it in this class because that's not the point of this class. That's going to come in grad school to really focus on the articulation therapy. How are you actually going to get the child to produce the sounds in the correct way? But this is what you need, this basis, first of all, to understand what they need to be doing, and then about their phonology, the system that they have. And then you can go in and work on the techniques, but that comes in grad school. Sophie Levy says, I'm very curious as to how I can set my future children up for success in regards to their early communicative and speech skills. And, talking to infants, singing, reading, yes, all of those things, but language is such an important part of, it's one of these things where it's not like there's one way to do it. So kids all around the world are going to figure out, they're going to learn their language no matter what the environment, essentially. So you have people where they're talking all the time to their kids. You have some cultures where they're on horseback and they're not communicating during the day or whatever. Somehow it all works out. So children are able to soak it up, and it's almost just built into us that we're able to learn these languages. If you want to help your child, though, yeah, that's the thinking, is communicate as much as you can and interact as much as you can to create that bond and create that love of language and that exposure. But that's certainly going to help. Whether the baby signs or all that, is that useful? I'm not sure about that. So you can decide on your own on that one. Lexia Sorensen said, when learning about manner the other week, I was curious to know if people who stuttered only prolonged fricative consonants and repeated stop consonants, or fricatives are also commonly repeated. Yeah, people who stutter do pretty much everything, and everybody's a little bit different, all the people who stutter. It's a wonderful population. It's a very interesting thing to work on in our field, but you find all kinds of things. You find people who stutter, who block on the, like you said, on these stop consonants, but also the fricatives, and sometimes they'll just prolong the sound. So there are many different patterns for stuttering. And Julian Vaklinov said, I've always wondered about the correlation between spoken language and music in terms of how a song is sung using both the principles of language and music simultaneously. Right. I mean, they're interrelated, but that connection is not always so clear. And people, it's kind of common, almost like folklore, that, well, if you're good at music, you're good at languages, that kind of thing. I'm not sure. I think there has been some research on that. It's really hard to say. But certainly when we talked about the super segmentals, there's quite a bit of music in how we communicate in our speech. So I think there is some overlap, there's some connection, but the exactly how they tie in is not so clear. Audrey Shinsky says, why is spelling so important for grading when in grade school? When children spell phonetically, they're ridiculed for it. I guess I don't understand where we got the notion that phonetic spelling is wrong. I mean, this is really a great point. So, right, why do we? Well, I guess we just have decided that as a, in our society that we want to have one standard for written language, and that's going to make it easier to decide, if something is right or wrong. But do you have to do that? No. And if you go back to sort of the Shakespeare period, people talk about Shakespeare quite a bit. You're going back a couple hundred years, but in Shakespeare's time, apparently spelling was not that important. So people spelled words different ways. It just didn't matter. So you kind of spelled your word, and there were some typical ones that people use, but you might spell it one way this and then tomorrow a different way. And it just didn't seem to matter so much as today. We definitely have this idea that it's got to be spelled a certain way. So yeah, I don't know. That's a more of a philosophical question. Certainly people do like to have something that they could say, this is right, this is wrong. But whether we could survive if we just went to more of an open system where people didn't care about the spelling, it's hard to imagine in our current culture, but there's no reason in some ways why we couldn't move to that kind of thinking. Especially if we have the IPA that would tell you exactly what the sound is anyway. Now, Sarah Scrape says, I've been wondering what changes people have made to their study habits, as this will be my last one because this is a very good way to end this. Sarah Scrape, I've been wondering what changes people have made to their study habits as the semester continues to become more difficult. What hasn't been working and what has been working for you when studying, et cetera. As a transfer student, it's been a little difficult to transition, right? So I've talked to many of you in office hours or just after class because we know this is very challenging. It can be very hard especially for transfer students, because you're kind of coming into a new environment. Sometimes you're away from your family, away from where you were for the last 2 years. You're kind of used to that system, coming into a new system, and then you're getting hit with a couple of our hardest classes in this major. So we know it's very challenging, but I think people just need to really focus and think, okay, this is my dream. I do want to be a speech therapist or audiologist or SLPA or whatever brought you here, or researcher, right? This is the time I need to devote my time now. A lot of times when I'm working with high school kids, I'll try to tell them that, invest now, and then your life is going to be a little bit easier, versus take it easy now. Your life might be more challenging. You might have a harder time figuring out a good way to get a good job that's going to make you happier, or for you to be able to achieve the dreams that you want. So I think the same thing for everybody in this class is that if this is your dream, if this is something that you really want to do, then now you need to devote the time for sure and the effort. Now, some people are putting in all the time, but really, let's be honest. I mean, pretty much everybody could always put a little more time into these things, somehow, right? So, but if you are putting in some time, and as much time as you probably really can, then if it's not working out and you're still struggling, you need to figure out, okay, what do I need to change? So then I think you need to rely on each other, get in study groups, find some partners in class, make sure you're not just out there alone. You need some support. So get your study groups going. If you need to have a tutor or something like that, let me know and I can try to arrange one. Work through NISHLA, because you can meet people through there and they can help you. Make sure that you're doing all the things that you really need to do. I mean, make sure that you're reviewing the lectures, you're reviewing the PowerPoints, the notes, which are provided by our 2 volunteer note takers, are wonderful. And so make sure you're looking at those. We've got the videos, we've got the book. Make sure you're reading the book and doing the practice exercises. So there's a lot to do. I have study guides for everything, for the tests, for the quizzes. So nothing should be a big surprise. You kind of know what you're responsible for. So you just have to really focus, put in that time, figure out what study things work for you. And this is such a great question. And really, I think all of you need to work together to figure out what's going to bring the most success for you individually, whatever is going to work the best for you. So on that, I'm going to wrap it up. I think these were wonderful questions, and I really wanted to just devote some time to at least discussing these. And certainly nothing in here was, mandatory for this course, but I hope that you found it enjoyable or had some, maybe some interesting points that you could think about. Feel free to email me with questions or just post them back up to the discussion board on anything based on this conversation that we just had. So thank you so much for everybody for participating in this. I think it was a great, great job. We really had some wonderful questions and great answers too. So see you in class.